Everyone mocked a man for building a house from abandoned pallets until they saw what he built. While other kids in his neighborhood spent their free time playing video games or watching TV, John would wander through the alleys and side streets of his small town, picking up pieces of wood, old tools, or broken furniture. He didn't see them as trash. To him, each discarded object held a secret potential, a story waiting to be told, a life waiting to be given back. As he grew older, John's fascination with creating things out of nothing only deepened. He had a small workshop behind his modest home where he would tinker with old appliances, scrap metal, and wooden boards he rescued from dumpsters. Sometimes, neighbors would peek over the fence, shaking their heads, whispering to one another. "That man is wasting his time again," they would say. "Why can't he do something normal?" But John paid no attention. In his mind, normal had never felt right, and the thought of following the crowd made him uneasy. One crisp morning, as the sun painted golden streaks across the sky, John was walking past an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of town. His eyes fell on a stack of old wooden pallets leaning against a wall. They were worn and splintered, some with nails sticking out at odd angles. Most people would have walked past them, seeing nothing but broken wood, but John's heart skipped a beat. He immediately envisioned the possibilities. "I can make something beautiful out of this," he whispered to himself, almost as if he were sharing a secret with the pallets themselves. He hurried home and began gathering supplies, screws, hammers, saws, and old paint he had collected over the years. He sketched designs on scraps of paper, thinking carefully about every detail. His plan was bold. He would build a house using only these abandoned pallets. When he told his neighbors, their laughter was immediate. "Are you serious?" asked Mr. Collins, the baker next door, his flour-dusted hands shaking with disbelief. "A house from pallets? You'll get splinters for a lifetime." "Yeah, John," chimed in Mrs. Patel from across the street. "Even if it stands, it will look like a shack, not a home." The children in the neighborhood started calling him the Pallet Man, and it wasn't long before the nickname spread. People snickered whenever they saw him carrying a pallet across the street or hammering wood in his backyard. Some even dared to leave sarcastic notes in his mailbox. "Good luck surviving the first rain." But John smiled at all of it. He wasn't building the house for approval or attention. He was building it because it excited him, because the idea of transforming something discarded into something valuable filled him with a joy he had never felt before. He began each day before sunrise, the chill of the morning brushing against his face, and he worked until the sun dipped below the horizon. Sweat ran down his forehead, and his hands became calloused and rough, but he felt alive in a way he never had when he was idle. As the first week passed, his neighbors started noticing him hauling the pallets from the warehouse and arranging them in neat piles behind his home. Some came closer, curiosity overcoming their skepticism. Children peeked through the fence, wide-eyed, whispering to each other. "Do you think he can really do it?" one asked. "It's just a bunch of broken wood." But John didn't need their approval. He worked meticulously, sanding the rough edges, removing nails that could be dangerous, and thinking about how each pallet could fit together. He learned to see the wood not as broken, but as raw material with endless potential. Each piece told him a story, and he responded by giving it a purpose. By the end of the first month, a structure had begun to take shape in John's backyard. It was rough, yes, and the boards were uneven in some places, but it had character. Passers-by stopped to gawk, some shaking their heads, others whispering, "It can't last through the rain," or "He's wasting his time again." John didn't argue. Instead, he invited the curious onlookers to watch him work, explaining gently what he was doing. "See this," he would say, pointing to a joint he had reinforced. "It may look weak, but once it's secured, it's stronger than it seems. Every mistake teaches me something new." Slowly, the children began to admire him. They watched his patience, the way he carefully studied each board before placing it. Some even started helping him, passing nails, holding boards in place, or fetching tools. Despite their early skepticism, a few adults began to notice something unusual. John wasn't just stacking pallets. He was building a home that was functional, well-ventilated, and surprisingly neat. He had windows framed carefully to catch sunlight, and he had begun experimenting with insulation using old blankets and cardboard. He talked to the children about reusing materials and showed them how even broken objects could have a second life. "Nothing is truly useless," he said one day, holding up a splintered pallet. "It's just waiting for someone to see its worth." The laughter from the neighbors didn't entirely stop. Some people still muttered behind their hands, calling John stubborn or foolish. But now there was a new sound in the neighborhood: curiosity. People began to walk past slowly, watching his progress. Mothers would point and say, "Look, he's really doing something with those pallets." Even Mr. Collins, the baker, stopped leaving sarcastic notes and instead began offering John bread as a small gesture of encouragement. What kept John going, however, wasn't praise or attention. It was the vision in his mind, the house he imagined rising from what everyone else considered junk. Every morning, he would wake with excitement, wondering how today's work would bring him closer to that dream. He felt a deep connection to the materials, as if each pallet had chosen him to give it a second chance. He would run his hands over the rough wood, feeling its texture, imagining where it would go and how it would support the walls, the roof, and eventually the life inside. Weeks turned into months, and slowly the structure became recognizable as a home. The base was sturdy, reinforced with extra planks. The walls were aligned carefully, and John had started framing a small porch. The children who had been watching from the start now ran errands for him, carrying small tools, sweeping sawdust, and sometimes just sitting quietly beside him, learning without even realizing it. Even in moments of exhaustion, John found joy. When a piece of wood didn't fit perfectly, he laughed, seeing it as a challenge rather than a failure. When nails bent or splintered, he would say, "Well, that's another lesson for me," and start over. His resilience fascinated the neighborhood children, who began to see that creativity wasn't about talent alone. It was about patience, dedication, and the courage to pursue an idea even when everyone else doubts you. By the end of the first part of his journey, John's backyard had transformed from a quiet patch of grass into a workshop filled with the smell of sawdust, the sound of hammers, and the sight of pallets stacked and ready for assembly. People had started to stop by not to mock, but to watch, to learn, and to understand how something ordinary, even discarded, could be turned into something extraordinary. For John, it was never about proving anyone wrong. It was about proving to himself that he could turn a dream into reality, one pallet at a time. And deep down, he knew that this was just the beginning. The house was rising, yes, but more than that, he was building a story that would one day surprise everyone who had doubted him, including the neighbors who had once laughed so hard at the idea of a house made from abandoned pallets. The mornings in John's neighborhood had begun to change. Where once the streets were quiet and filled with whispers about the pallet man, now there was a growing sense of curiosity. Children ran to his yard every day, eager to see the progress he had made, while adults who had been skeptical started glancing over fences, unable to ignore the steady transformation happening in front of them. John greeted each day with energy and focus. Even though the work was exhausting, his determination never wavered. He had learned early on that building a home from discarded pallets was not an easy task. Each piece of wood had its own story. Some were cracked, some were warped, and some were almost beyond repair. But to John, every challenge was an opportunity to learn. He measured carefully, cut precisely, and reinforced weak sections, imagining the home in its final form. One chilly morning, John stepped into his yard, rubbing the sleep from his eyes. The piles of pallets seemed even larger than the day before, each stack representing hours of labor and the potential of something great. He took a deep breath, inhaling the crisp air mixed with the scent of sawdust, and began his work. Today, he decided, he would focus on the walls and make sure the structure was strong enough to support a roof. As he lifted a particularly heavy pallet, he noticed a small group of children peeking through the fence. "Morning, John," they called, waving with excitement. One boy, Tommy, who had been quiet for most of the last month, stepped forward. "Can I help today?" he asked, eyes wide with eagerness. John smiled warmly. "Of course," he replied. "Grab those gloves and we'll make a team of builders." The children learned quickly under John's patient guidance. He showed them how to sand the rough edges to prevent splinters, how to check for nails that were sticking out, and how to fit pieces together so that the walls would be stable. Some of the adults from nearby houses started watching from a distance, shaking their heads in disbelief, but unable to hide a growing sense of respect. "Look at him," murmured Mrs. Patel, standing on her porch. "He's teaching the children something important, not just building a house." By the second week of this phase, the structure was beginning to take on a more recognizable shape. The walls were up, and the frame for the roof had been carefully constructed. Passers-by could no longer dismiss it as a pile of junk. It had height, symmetry, and a surprising sense of order. Yet some neighbors still doubted that the structure could withstand the elements. Mr. Collins, the baker who had once called the idea foolish, stopped by one afternoon with a tray of warm bread. "I don't understand it," he admitted as he handed John the tray. "It looks stable, but pallets, really?" John chuckled. "It's all about patience and planning," he explained. "Every piece has a place and every piece supports the next. It's like a puzzle, but with wood and nails." John continued to work tirelessly, sometimes alone, sometimes with the children helping him carry lighter boards or holding pieces in place. He painted certain pallets with colors he had found from old leftover paint cans, imagining how the house would appear when complete, bright, welcoming, and unique. For him, the work was a mix of art and engineering, creativity and practicality. One day, a small incident occurred that could have discouraged him. A strong gust of wind swept through the neighborhood, knocking over a partially completed section of the wall. Wood splintered, and the pallets crashed to the ground. Children gasped, expecting John to be angry or frustrated, but he simply nodded thoughtfully, assessing the damage. "This is just another lesson," he said calmly. "We'll rebuild it stronger." He spent hours carefully reconstructing the section, reinforcing it more securely than before. The children watched in awe as he turned what could have been a failure into an opportunity to improve. That day, John didn't just teach carpentry. He taught resilience, patience, and the power of never giving up. Weeks passed, and the house began to look less like a collection of scrap wood and more like a true home. John had added small touches that made the structure both practical and beautiful. Windows framed with pallets allowed sunlight to flood the interior during the day, while small vents made sure the house would be airy and comfortable. He had even started planning a small garden area beside the porch, where he would later grow vegetables and flowers in containers made from recycled pallets. The neighbors could no longer ignore what John was accomplishing. A few brave adults came closer, asking questions about how he managed to make the structure stable. John answered politely, showing them his techniques and explaining how every nail and plank was carefully positioned. Some were genuinely impressed. "I never thought of using materials this way," admitted one neighbor, shaking his head. "You've created something out of nothing." John smiled but remained humble. "It's all about seeing potential where others see waste," he replied. The children continued to be his biggest supporters. They loved to watch him work, asking endless questions and helping in small but meaningful ways. John encouraged them, teaching them not just about building but about creativity, problem-solving, and environmental responsibility. He explained that by reusing materials, they were not only saving money but also helping the planet. As the months went by, the house's frame was complete, and John began working on the finer details. He designed clever storage spaces within the walls, making use of pallets to create shelves and cupboards. He reinforced corners with additional wood, making the house surprisingly sturdy for something built entirely from recycled materials. He even carved small patterns into the wood to add a decorative touch. People started to take pictures and share them with friends, spreading the word about John's unusual project. Some townspeople who had once laughed now stopped by to offer encouragement. Children from other neighborhoods began visiting, eager to see the pallet house and watch John at work. Despite the attention, John remained focused on his goal. He continued to work long hours, often losing track of time as he carefully measured, cut, and assembled each pallet. He treated each day as a new opportunity to improve, and every challenge as a chance to grow. Rainy days didn't stop him. He simply covered the pallets with tarps and continued working as soon as the weather cleared. Evenings were spent planning the next steps. John would sit on a small bench in his yard, looking at the partially completed house and imagining the finished product. He envisioned the colors, the garden, the sunlight streaming through the windows, and the cozy spaces inside. It was this vision that kept him motivated, even when the work was physically demanding and progress seemed slow. Neighbors began to respect John not just for the house, but for his dedication and work ethic. They noticed how he never complained, how he treated children and helpers with kindness, and how he approached every challenge with patience and optimism. Slowly, the mockery that had greeted him at the beginning of his journey was replaced with admiration. One day, as John was adjusting a particularly tricky corner of the roof, Mr. Collins, the baker, approached him again. "I don't know how you do it," he said, genuinely impressed. "It's amazing. You've turned these old pallets into something incredible." John paused, smiling at the acknowledgement but keeping his focus on the task at hand. "It's not about the wood," he said simply. "It's about the effort, the care, and the vision. Anyone can build a house if they put their heart into it." By the end of this phase of construction, the house was clearly standing tall, its frame sturdy and ready for the roof. The walls were reinforced, the windows framed, and the porch taking shape. The children were practically bursting with excitement, proud to have played even a small role in the creation. Neighbors who had once mocked him now spoke in hushed tones, impressed by the skill and determination on display. John looked at the structure and felt a quiet sense of accomplishment. It wasn't finished yet, and there was still work to be done, but the journey so far had been rewarding. He had turned skepticism into curiosity, doubt into admiration, and discarded wood into something meaningful. Most importantly, he had proven to himself that imagination, hard work, and perseverance could overcome even the greatest doubts. Little did he know, the most surprising reactions were yet to come. Once the house was fully completed, it would not only defy expectations, but also inspire the entire community to think differently about creativity, resourcefulness, and the value of seeing potential where others see waste. The seasons began to shift as John's project moved closer to completion. The warm summer air had given way to a cool autumn breeze, and the neighborhood was alive with the changing colors of the trees. For John, the passing of days was measured not by the calendar, but by the progress of the house he was building. Every morning, he stepped into his yard with a sense of excitement, eager to bring his vision closer to life. The house, which had once been a simple frame of stacked pallets, was now taking on a form that astonished even the most skeptical onlookers. The walls were smooth and sturdy, reinforced in ways that no one could have imagined. John had carefully sanded each board, painted sections in warm, inviting colors, and creatively arranged the wood to create patterns that made the structure visually appealing. It was no longer just a functional building, it was a work of art. John worked methodically, focusing on each detail with precision. The roof, which had initially seemed like the most daunting task, was now steadily rising. He had designed it to be both strong and weather-resistant, using overlapping pallets to create natural drainage channels. As he positioned each plank, he explained to the children who had come to help, "See how this layer supports the one above it. That's the secret to a strong roof." The children listened with wide eyes, fascinated by the idea that something so simple could be so clever. The small garden beside the porch was starting to flourish as well. John had repurposed old crates and containers into planters, filling them with vegetables, herbs, and flowers. The air around the house was fragrant with the scent of blooming marigolds and fresh basil, creating a peaceful and welcoming atmosphere. Even the neighbors who had been critical at first could not help but notice how beautiful the property was becoming. As the weeks went by, John began working on the interior of the house. He used pallets to create built-in shelves, cupboards, and storage spaces, maximizing every inch of the small home. Each feature was carefully planned, and every corner had a purpose. The children helped paint some sections, adding a playful touch to the otherwise practical design. "It feels like a real home," said one of the boys, running his fingers over a painted shelf. John smiled, knowing that the house was not just a building. It was a space that could nurture imagination and creativity. The transformation was gradual but undeniable. People who had once laughed at John now walked by with a sense of curiosity and admiration. They would pause at the fence, whispering to each other, "I can't believe it, it's actually looking like a proper house." Even Mr. Collins, the baker, began stopping by more often, offering snacks and advice, though mostly to watch John at work. One rainy afternoon, John worked under a large tarp, his clothes damp but his spirits high. Water dripped from the edges of the shelter, and the wind rattled the makeshift cover, but he continued hammering and adjusting planks with care. The children gathered close, fascinated by the way he turned each challenge into an opportunity to improve the house. "Why don't you get tired?" asked one of the girls, shivering under her raincoat. John paused, wiping the sweat from his brow, and replied, "Because I'm building something that will last, something that matters. When you care about what you're creating, the hard work doesn't feel like work at all." By the time winter approached, the exterior of the house was nearly complete. The pallets had been sanded, painted, and secured so carefully that the house looked polished and intentional rather than cobbled together. John had even added a small porch roof to protect visitors from rain and snow, and he had constructed a tiny seating area where people could relax and enjoy the garden. The house had transformed from a pile of old pallets into a warm, welcoming space, and the community was starting to take notice in ways John could not have imagined. One morning, a group of neighbors gathered outside the fence, whispering excitedly. Word had spread that the pallet house was almost finished, and people wanted to see it for themselves. They had watched John work for months, but they had never truly understood the vision behind his efforts. Now, curiosity was replacing skepticism. John, who had been adjusting a window frame, noticed the growing crowd and waved warmly. "Come closer," he called. "I'll show you what we've done." Some adults hesitated, unsure if they should enter, but the children ran ahead, eager to explore. One by one, the neighbors stepped into the yard, their eyes widening as they took in the house. It was more than a home. The structure was clever, practical, and surprisingly elegant. Every pallet had been placed with intention, forming walls that were both strong and visually appealing. The windows allowed sunlight to filter in, illuminating the interior and highlighting the carefully arranged shelves and cupboards. The garden added color and life, making the entire property feel welcoming and alive. Mrs. Patel, who had been one of John's harshest critics, stood silently, her hands clasped together. I didn't think it could be done," she said softly, her voice filled with awe. John simply nodded, a quiet smile on his face. "It's not about what others think," he said. "It's about believing in an idea and working patiently to make it real." The children ran through the house, testing the shelves, peeking into cupboards, and laughing as they explored. John watched them with pride, knowing that the house was already serving its purpose, teaching, inspiring, and bringing joy. Even the adults could not help but be impressed by the ingenuity and creativity on display. Neighbors began asking questions, genuinely interested in how John had accomplished what had once seemed impossible. He explained the process of reinforcing the pallets, the techniques he had used to make the structure weather-resistant, and the ways he had maximized space inside the house. People were fascinated not just by the physical result, but by John's dedication and resourcefulness. As the days passed, the story of the pallet house spread beyond the neighborhood. Friends of neighbors, curious townspeople, and even visitors from nearby towns came to see John's creation. Everyone was amazed at how something so simple, so ordinary, could be transformed into a functional, beautiful home. What had once been mocked as foolishness was now celebrated as ingenuity. John, however, remained humble. He never sought praise or attention. His satisfaction came from seeing the transformation unfold and knowing that he had stayed true to his vision. He continued to work on small details, adding finishing touches to the interior, arranging the garden, and making sure every corner of the house was perfect. For him, the journey was as important as the destination, and every day brought new opportunities to improve and create. The children continued to be his helpers and companions. They had learned so much from him, not just carpentry, but patience, creativity, and the value of hard work. They saw firsthand how imagination, determination, and perseverance could turn even discarded materials into something extraordinary. John encouraged them to dream big, showing them that limitations were often only what people believed them to be. By the time the first snow fell, the pallet house was ready. The roof was complete, the walls were strong, and the garden was thriving despite the cold. The structure stood proudly in John's yard, a symbol of creativity, resilience, and dedication. Even those who had once mocked him had come to appreciate the beauty and ingenuity of his work. One quiet evening, John stood on the small porch, looking out at the neighborhood. The house glowed softly in the fading light, warm and inviting. He felt a deep sense of satisfaction, knowing that he had achieved something remarkable. It wasn't just a house made from pallets. It was proof that vision, hard work, and belief in oneself could overcome doubt, ridicule, and skepticism. The neighbors who had once laughed now admired him. The children who had once watched from the fence now felt inspired, and John himself knew that this was only the beginning. The final step, the true revelation of what he had created, was yet to come. And when it arrived, it would surprise everyone who had ever doubted him. The morning sun rose gently over the neighborhood, casting a warm, golden light on John's yard. A soft mist hung in the air, and the faint smell of dew and fresh grass filled the streets. For John, this was a special day. After months of careful planning, hard work, and tireless dedication, the pallet house was finally complete. Today, he would open it to the community and show everyone what had been quietly taking shape in his backyard. The children who had been helping him from the beginning were the first to arrive. Their excitement was almost impossible to contain. They had watched the house grow from rough, splintered pallets into a sturdy, colorful home, but nothing had prepared them for the moment when they would step inside. Tommy, the boy who had first asked to help, bounced on his toes, his eyes wide. "I can't wait to see it," he exclaimed. John smiled at their enthusiasm. "Patience," he said gently. "The best things are worth waiting for. Come with me and you'll see." Word had spread through the neighborhood, and by mid-morning a small crowd had gathered outside the fence. Adults and children alike were buzzing with curiosity, whispering to each other about what the final house would look like. Some of the neighbors who had once laughed at John's idea now stood quietly, their expressions a mix of doubt and anticipation. As John unlocked the small gate and stepped aside, the children rushed forward, followed slowly by the adults. The first thing everyone noticed was the craftsmanship. The house, which had seemed impossible at first, was now a beautiful, functional home. The pallets had been transformed into walls that were not only strong, but also visually appealing, with patterns and textures that gave the house character and warmth. The windows let in streams of sunlight, illuminating the interior and highlighting the clever design. Shelves, cupboards, and storage spaces had been built into the walls, all made from recycled pallets, but arranged so cleverly that no one would have guessed their original purpose. Even the porch, small but welcoming, seemed to invite visitors to sit and relax, enjoying the garden and the peaceful atmosphere. Mrs. Patel, who had once been one of John's harshest critics, stepped closer, her eyes wide with astonishment. It's amazing," she whispered almost to herself. "I didn't think it could look like this." John simply nodded, his calm smile showing both pride and humility. "It's all about seeing potential," he said softly. "These pallets were once considered useless. I just gave them a second chance." The children ran through the house, opening cupboards, examining shelves, and exploring every corner. Laughter filled the air as they discovered little details John had included for fun. A small hidden nook for reading, a miniature shelf for toys, and tiny decorations carved into the wood. John watched them with a quiet joy, knowing that the house was already serving a purpose beyond shelter. It was inspiring creativity, curiosity, and a love for learning. Even the adults couldn't hide their amazement. Mr. Collins, the baker, who had once been one of the loudest critics, stood silently in the doorway, his mouth slightly open. I don't know what to say," he admitted finally. "I thought it would be a pile of scrap, but it's perfect. It's like it belongs here." John smiled. "It's not about perfection," he explained. "It's about care, patience, and imagination. Anyone can create something beautiful if they put their heart into it." Neighbors began asking questions, eager to understand how John had accomplished something so extraordinary. He patiently explained the techniques he had used, from reinforcing pallets to arranging the wood for maximum strength, and even showed them how he had designed storage spaces and clever features inside. People were fascinated not just by the house itself, but by John's dedication, skill, and vision. One of the children asked, "John, why did you want to build this house with pallets?" He knelt down to their level, brushing sawdust from his hands. "Because I wanted to show that even things that seem useless can become something wonderful," he said. "I wanted to prove that with patience, hard work, and imagination, you can turn anything into something valuable." The crowd grew larger as word of the finished house spread. Friends, family, and even strangers from nearby neighborhoods came to see the pallet house. Everyone marveled at how a structure that had once been mocked could now inspire such admiration. They took pictures, whispered in awe, and asked John countless questions about the process. John, however, remained humble. He didn't seek recognition. His reward was in seeing the joy and amazement on the faces of those around him. Children played in the garden, adults explored the interior, and the small neighborhood that had once doubted him now celebrated what he had accomplished. It was a moment of quiet triumph, not just for John, but for the idea that creativity and perseverance could overcome skepticism and ridicule. The house also began to have a positive effect on the neighborhood itself. People who had once ignored recycling or discarded materials now started thinking differently. They began collecting pallets, old crates, and other items, inspired by the idea that even the simplest objects could be transformed into something useful. John's project became more than a house. It became a lesson in resourcefulness and sustainability, sparking a wave of creativity in the community. As the day went on, John walked around his yard, showing people the details he had included. He pointed out the hidden storage spaces, the reinforced corners, and the clever use of light and ventilation. He explained how he had arranged the pallets to create patterns on the walls, making the house both sturdy and visually appealing. Each visitor left with a new appreciation for the potential of ordinary materials and the power of imagination. By afternoon, the neighborhood had gathered completely. Children climbed on the porch, adults stood in small groups talking quietly, and even those who had doubted John from the beginning were now openly admiring his work. The air was filled with excitement, laughter, and a sense of community that had not existed before. Mrs. Patel approached John once more. "I have to admit," she said, smiling warmly, "I never thought I would see the day when I'd admire a house made from pallets. You've changed the way I think about things." John nodded, humbled by her words. "It's amazing how perspective can change," he replied. "All it takes is patience and a willingness to see what others might miss." The sun began to set, casting a warm, golden glow over the house. The colors of the pallets looked even more vibrant in the fading light, and the garden seemed to glow with life. John stood on the porch for a moment, taking it all in. The house was complete, but it was more than a structure. It was a symbol of creativity, determination, and the ability to transform challenges into opportunities. Evening fell, and the crowd slowly began to disperse. Children reluctantly left, promising to return the next day to continue exploring, while adults walked home with new ideas and a renewed sense of possibility. John stayed on the porch a little longer, watching the stars appear one by one in the clear night sky. He felt a deep sense of peace, knowing that he had stayed true to his vision and created something meaningful. The next morning, word of the pallet house spread beyond the neighborhood. People from other towns came to see it, inspired by the idea that ordinary materials could be transformed into extraordinary structures. Local newspapers and social media shared the story, calling it an example of innovation, perseverance, and environmental awareness. John's project, once mocked and doubted, had become a source of pride and inspiration for many. John continued to live in the house, adding small improvements and teaching the children new skills. The neighborhood, which had once been skeptical, now looked up to him as a mentor and an example of what can be achieved with imagination and hard work. The house had become more than a home. It had become a community project, a place where people learned, shared, and dreamed. In the end, John's story was a reminder that true value is not always obvious at first glance. The pallets that others discarded as useless had been transformed into a beautiful, functional home. The laughter and doubt of the neighbors had turned into admiration and respect. And most importantly, John had proven that determination, creativity, and patience could overcome any challenge. The pallet house stood proudly in the small neighborhood, a symbol of hope, innovation, and the magic that happens when someone believes in their vision. Children continued to play in its garden. Adults continued to admire its clever design, and John continued to build, teach, and inspire. The house was more than wood and nails. It was a testament to the power of believing in yourself and seeing possibilities where others see nothing. And so, the man who had once been mocked for building a house from abandoned pallets became a quiet hero in his community. A reminder that with imagination, patience, and determination, even the most impossible dreams can become reality.